Every time I talk about how masturbation is a sin, I get like a 50-50 split in my comments talking about how it is a sin or how it isn't a sin.
All right, let's see it.
And I wanted to address the people that think it's not a sin real quick and ask a couple of questions. First, have you read about sexual immorality in the Bible?
Yeah. Have you read about sexual immorality in the Bible? I don't think you have. Here's a short reading list. You read these books and papers, and you will know more about sexual immorality in the Bible and in the broader biblical world than any person you will ever come in contact with. And you will disabuse yourself of a lot of fundamentalist, right-wing authoritarian, apologetic ideas about sexuality and the Bible, which really have very little at all to do with the Bible itself, and mostly have to do with the credibility enhancing displays and the costly signaling that have accreted to the particular tradition with which you identify.
Have you looked into the definition of sexual immorality?
You cannot define sexual immorality. There is no the definition of sexual immorality. In addition to the fact that it is a conceptual category that cannot be usefully defined to begin with, it is relative. It is something that is going to differ from time to time, from place to place, and from group to group, because sexual immorality is just whatever a group thinks is sexually immoral. And that is, again, entirely subjective and relative. There is no single definition, and any definition that you provide is, one, not going to include a lot of things that many groups think are sexually immoral, and two, include a lot of things that many groups do not think are sexually immoral. And the Bible is no exception. The Bible does not take one single approach to what is sexually immoral. Each author has a different approach, and sometimes there are individual authors who actually have multiple different approaches that are situationally and rhetorically emergent.
Because the blanket definition is anything outside of the covenant of marriage is sexual immorality.
Yeah, that's not a useful definition of sexual immorality, because that means there is no sexual immorality inside the covenant of marriage. And that legitimizes things like marital rape and things like that. And there are plenty of groups around the world and throughout time who have considered there to be many sexually immoral things that could happen within the covenant of marriage. And there are Christian groups and Jewish groups and other groups that surrounded the societies that are responsible for writing the biblical literature that thought the same thing. In fact, we can find Jewish literature that says it's considered sexually immoral for a man to be on the bottom during sex with his own wife. And certainly there are things like anal sex and oral sex and other types of sex that have long been considered immoral by Christian and Jewish groups. And we can find examples of that in early Judaism and in the Bible. There were a lot of early Jewish people who thought that it was sexually immoral to engage in intercourse between husband and wife in any other circumstances except the express purpose of procreation. Meaning that if the wife was pregnant, sex was immoral. If the wife was no longer able to have children, sex was immoral. If it was done just for fun, then sex was immoral. In fact, Paul seems to suggest that sex could be immoral within marriage if it was done with just a little too much exuberance, the passion of desire, like how the dirty, dirty Gentiles engage in sexual intercourse. And at the same time, within the Bible, we find a lot of examples of sex outside of the covenant of marriage, which, by the way, is a very, very different covenant in different parts of the Bible that they didn't think was particularly problematic. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, visiting a sex worker was not considered particularly problematic. And really the reason that sex inside of marriage was considered sacrosanct at all was because a woman was viewed as property. At least her sexual availability and her procreative capacities were considered a commodity that was bought and sold. And when you bought it, you expected it to be in shiny new condition. And so this is why virginity was something that was so highly prized. And this is why a woman could be put to death, according to Deuteronomy 22, for engaging in sex before marriage. And this is why, if a man raped a virgin who was not betrothed or married, the punishment was just a fine that was paid to the father who had property rights over that virgin, and then he was required to marry her and could not divorce her for the rest of his life because she was damaged goods. She was not eligible for a proper Israelite marriage. But if a man raped a woman who was a virgin but was betrothed, or a woman who was already married to someone else, it was the death penalty, because they were two different types of property crime. And so the punishment differed depending on the relationship that that particular woman had to a man. And you have polygamy in the Hebrew Bible. That was normative. And according to the Bible, God not only approved it, but in certain circumstances facilitated it, caused it. And in a lot of periods of Judaism, to have sex with a woman who was neither betrothed nor married was the act of marrying her. It didn't matter if she was unmarried at the moment of having sex. The act of sexual intercourse obligated the two of you to get married. And so that was not considered immoral. So we can look throughout history, throughout the Bible, throughout the way people have read and interpreted the Bible since it was written, and we can find all different kinds of ideas about human sexuality and what was immoral, what was not immoral, and how those boundaries were incredibly fluid and very, very, very different from the reductive, the sophomoric, the juvenile notion that sexual immorality is any sex that occurs outside of the covenant of marriage.
Anything sexual done outside of the covenant of marriage is sexual immorality.
Yeah, still no. And let's revisit a consideration. When we look at the Hebrew Bible's position on same-sex intercourse, the only thing that we're going to find really, apart from Genesis 19's condemnation of the use of the threat of sexually assaulting other men as a means of subordinating, emasculating, feminizing those men as a punishment, we find Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20, verse 13, which may be inspired by the story of Genesis 19, in which case they would be very clearly about non-consensual intercourse. But the interesting thing here is what both of those passages do. Even though one of them condemns both parties, both passages are expressly prohibiting the man taking the insertive role, because that was considered the dominant role. And sex in antiquity was not a mutual activity that two equal partners engaged in. Sex was something that an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object. And the agency of the passive sexual object wasn't really that material to anything. So sex was something that somebody who was an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object, and usually a penis had to be involved. So when you say any sexual activity in the ancient world, the penis needed to be there for there to be anything describable as sexual activity, which is why something that is conspicuously absent from Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 is any mention of female same-sex intercourse, even though in the verses right after Leviticus 18:22 and 20 verse 13, in both chapters, it prohibits bestiality and then says, oh yeah, by the way, also women can't do this. Never says that about same-sex intercourse. Why? Because there's no penis involved. So it wasn't even considered sex, so they didn't care. So, according to your definition, female same-sex intercourse is not sexually immoral in the Hebrew Bible. Now, that is not how we organize our understanding of what sexual activity is. It's how they organized it in the ancient world, and it's why the authors of the Hebrew Bible didn't seem to have cared about female same-sex intercourse. So, in all of this, everything is socially, is historically, is rhetorically contingent. Everything is based on how they organize their understanding of these concepts. And so you can't just impose your own frameworks and interpretive lenses upon them and import all your own understandings of how sexual activity works, what sexual immorality is, onto those old texts. You can't do that without doing significant violence to what those authors were trying to communicate. And when you're doing that, you're just telling the Bible what it is and is not allowed to approve of and condemn. You are the one dictating to the Bible what it's going to be saying. And that's overwhelmingly what Christians do today. But that's not a legitimate biblical hermeneutic, at least not for anyone who pretends to treat the Bible as an authority. That's just treating the Bible as a rubber stamp on your own authority. And again, that authority is socially, is historically, is rhetorically contingent. It's going to change from time to time, from place to place, from person to person, from circumstance to circumstance, from group to group, from rhetorical exigency to rhetorical exigency. So that definition falls to utter pieces as soon as you have a modicum of historical competence, a modicum of critical thought. That definition means absolutely nothing to our interpretation of what's going on in the Bible.
And for those that comment, the verse is saying, like, what verse does it explicitly say that? What verse does it explicitly say that Jesus is God?
No verse, because nobody who was responsible for anything that ended up in the Bible actually thought that. At best, maybe you could make a case that it's plausible that a passage in Titus and a passage in 2 Peter somehow identify Jesus as God. But that's open for interpretive doubt as well. And whatever the nature of those authors' identifications of Jesus as God, by the way, not Peter and not Paul, they were written probably in the early 2nd century by people just pretending to be Peter and Paul. Whatever their understanding of the nature of Jesus' identification with God, it has absolutely nothing to do with Trinitarianism. So this person is trying to appeal to what they believe to be a pretty universal presupposition about a dogma related to the Bible as a rhetorical shoehorn to say, you accept this non-biblical doctrine, so why don't you accept this other doctrine that is not in the Bible that I'm insisting must be read into the lines of the Bible? Jesus is not God in the Bible, so this particular rhetorical shoehorn, this rhetorical lever, doesn't really work.
At what point does Jesus come out himself and say, Jesus is God? I am God. I am him, right? Yes, he comes out and he says, I am the way, right? But all these things lead to us knowing that he is claiming to be God.
No, they don't. It's post-biblical dogmas that developed that are what leads you to believe that's what's going on in the Bible. It's the interpretive lenses that didn't exist when the biblical texts were being written, certainly not when the Gospels were being written. They were developed after the Bible was completed, as people were looking back on the Bible and imposing unifying frameworks to make all the different parts of the Bible seem to agree with each other. That they came up with this philosophical innovation of the notion that Jesus is the very God of Israel.
He is the Son of God. He is God, right?
No, the New Testament presents Jesus as the Son of God, not as God. This is post-biblical dogma that you're trying to leverage as a rhetorical lever or shoehorn to compel people to agree with the notion that, hey, we all accept this as a dogma even though it's not explicitly in the text. But you could use that for almost anything that somebody at some point determined should be in the Bible. You know, things like, ooh, slavery not being okay. That's not in the Bible. In fact, there's no syllable of the Bible that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever questions, condemns, much less prohibits the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. That's another thing that was developed long after the Bible. And now we turn around and we impose it upon the Bible. We dictate to the Bible what it is and is not allowed to condemn or approve, because the tradition is the real authority. The Bible is not the real authority. It is just the proof text.
We know all of that because we have context clues.
No, you have tradition telling you how you're supposed to negotiate with the Bible.
So if we believe that, why can't we keep that same energy with things like masturbation?
Well, to the degree your tradition demands it, you're probably going to try to keep that same energy, whether or not you're successful. You're almost certainly going to perform that same energy when you're in social circumstances, even if privately that's something you are not able to do, which probably the majority of people are not going to be able to do. And this is something that leads to a lot of mental health problems in a lot of traditions, and in the past has led to teenagers taking their own lives because they're told that what they're doing is a grave sin, a sin next to murder, a sin that's going to render them unworthy, a sin that is going to lead them to hell or something like that. And they end up taking their own lives because they think it would be better off if they were dead rather than engaging in this sin. And this is something that is never once intimated as a sin anywhere in the Bible. This is something that people have decided to negotiate into the text because it is rhetorically useful for them. This is a costly signal. This is something that you are expected to be able to perform adherence to in order to demonstrate to other members of the group that you are committed to the group's standards and expectations and mores as a way to put on display that you are good enough. And that's what this video is. It's an attempt on the part of this content creator to put on display to other members of the group, hey, I'm committed to this. I'm going to stand up for it. I'm going to defend it. Because that makes you seem more credible in the eyes of other members of the group. It's a credibility-enhancing display and a costly signal, whether or not the person actually lives it, because there are an awful lot of people who will get out and pound the pulpit about this and then behind everybody's back is still engaging in it. The same with men who get out there and harangue the LGBTQIA plus communities and then later on get arrested for sexually abusing a young boy or something like that. So this is not a healthy approach. And no, this is not something that is in the Bible. And this is just an attempt to put on display a willingness and an eagerness to very conspicuously toe that line and defend that credence.
If the Bible doesn't explicitly say it, you can't learn from it.
There are lots of things that the Bible doesn't explicitly say that you should not be learning from. And there are even a lot of things in the Bible that the Bible does explicitly endorse that you should definitely not learn from. This is just poor rationalization.
That's not how this works. We have context clues. God gave us a conscience and a brain so that we could pick up on these things and so that we could see, like, hey, this is wrong.
There are no real context clues, and now what you're talking about is your intuitions. And your intuitions are not actually calibrated towards any kind of fundamental true morality. They're calibrated towards morality that has evolutionarily developed related to prosociality. And so what's really governing the desire to present masturbation as fundamentally sexually immoral is your desire to be a good standing member of the social groups that are important to you that also have that credence. And so in order to curate your standing within that social group or that intersection of social groups, and in order to advance the interests of that intersection of social groups, you are intuitively incentivized to go perform this piety publicly. That's evolutionarily what's going on with that idea in your brain about this being wrong.
And I'm not saying that to shame anybody or condemn anybody or say, like, oh, if you have a problem with lust and masturbation, you're done. Condemnation. No, I had a problem with lust and masturbation, and God broke me free from both of those things.
So now we're getting to the part where this content creator is going to say that they were cured of this thing by God, which is another feature of these credibility enhancing displays. It's another way to show to the group that you have applied the methods and the processes that are endorsed within the credences of the group, and you have come out the other side a changed person. But these are not pathologies. These are not diseases. This is something that is just part of the human condition. You can't get rid of it. You can exercise greater discipline. You can try to keep yourself out of circumstances that are going to cue your intuitions to these fundamentally natural features of the human experience, but it's not a disease to cure yourself of. Just like homosexuality is not a disease that one is cured of. Even though you have a lot of formerly gay people out riding the circuit, enhancing their credibility in front of other Christians because God cured them of this thing that is unnatural and that is immoral. And that's just more performance. That's just more costly signaling and credibility enhancing displays that is not in any way, shape, or form whatsoever substantiating the claim that the Bible actually requires this of anyone, because there's no part of the Bible that even addresses directly masturbation, much less identifies it as sexually immoral. Again, sexual immorality is socially, is historically, is rhetorically contingent. It's what a group decides is sexually immoral. It is not any sexual activity outside the covenant of marriage. That's not an analytically meaningful or useful definition. That's just rhetoric. And the fit for this video has been The Amazing Spider-Man.